At 57, after 28 years of marriage, Nora Harfield walked out of a Multnomah County courthouse with a manila folder, a cardboard box of personal effects, and the deed to a waterfront cannery on the Oregon coast she hadn't visited in nearly a decade. Her husband Glenn kept the house, the savings, the investment portfolio, and the Cannon Beach property they'd bought for retirement. His lawyers had called the Callister Cannery a liability asset, assessed at $17,000, and let her have it without argument. Nora drove 3 hours south through coastal cedar and grey rain, following a highway she hadn't taken since her father's funeral 8 years before. The cannery had been dark since Harold Callister died. His tide chart still hung on the foreman's wall. His reading glasses still sat folded on the old desk. But when she pried up the rag rug in Harold's private office and found the panel beneath the floor, she discovered something her father had sealed there for 30 years. Something the fishing families of Dunhaven Bay had spent a generation quietly wondering about. The courtroom smelled like recycled air and industrial carpet, the particular institutional smell Nora associated with every place where important decisions were made about other people's lives. She sat on the left side of a long table, while Glenn's lawyers arranged papers on the right. Glenn himself wasn't there. He'd sent a man named Greer, junior partner, blue tie. The expensive kind of blue that meant you had never once worried about the cost of things. Greer smiled at her once when she sat down. A professional smile, unconnected to any feeling. The mediator was a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain. She read the terms of the proposed settlement in a flat, measured voice, the way you'd read a grocery list. The primary residence in Lake Oswego, remaining mortgage balance of $216,000, is retained by Mr. Harfield. The investment accounts, current market value of approximately $440,000, are retained by Mr. Harfield per the prenuptial instrument. The retirement portfolio, current value $192,000. Nora listened the way you listen to weather reports when there's nothing you can do about the weather. She had signed the prenuptial the summer before their wedding because Glenn asked her to, and she had believed his asking meant something other than what it turned out to mean. She'd been 29 then, working at a design firm in Portland, just beginning to learn the difference between what people said and what they intended. Glenn had been 40, already successful, confident in a way that felt like safety. He had grey at his temples even then. She had found it distinguished. She had stopped finding it distinguished approximately 12 years in, when she understood that the confidence was not the same thing as reliability, that it was the appearance of someone who knew the value of things, which was different from understanding the value of things. It had taken her another 16 years to understand the difference well enough to name it. Greer passed a single-page asset schedule across the table. Per the settlement, Miss Harfield retains personal property, the 2019 Subaru Outback, and the real property located at 4 Cannery Row, Dunhaven, Oregon, the Callister Cannery, assessed at $17,000 in the attached appraisal. The Callister Cannery, the mediator repeated. Is that to your satisfaction? Nora looked at the line on the page. She hadn't seen the property in 8 years, since she'd driven down for Harold's funeral and spent 3 days in a rented motel room sorting through what needed sorting before she locked the door and drove back to Portland. She'd told herself she'd deal with it later. Later never came. Glenn's lawyers had appraised it at $17,000. The building was 40 years old, waterfront but far from tourist useful, the kind of property that cost more to maintain than it earned. They weren't doing her any favors by letting her keep it. They were doing themselves one. It's fine, she said. She signed where indicated, 7 signatures. 4 initials. 28 years became a stack of paper in a manila folder. She carried the cardboard box to the parking garage herself. Glenn had left it at the front desk that morning, a box containing a jewelry box from her mother, 3 photo albums, and a day planner she'd kept for years. She wasn't sure why he'd included the planner. Maybe Greer had packed it. Maybe Glenn had just swept everything in the guest room into a box and called it done. That would have been very Glenn. She sat behind the wheel for a long time. She had nowhere she needed to be. She had friends in Portland, women she'd met through Glenn's professional circles, the kind of friends you see at dinner parties and fundraisers, who send a note when something goes wrong and don't follow up to find out if it went right. She had Connie, her college roommate, who would have her over without a single question asked. She had her brother Carl in Medford, with whom she had spoken approximately 6 times in the last decade. She didn't call any of them. She pulled out of the parking garage and pointed the car south. Interstate gave way to highway. Highway to state route. State route to coastal road. The rain started near Lincoln City and stayed with her, not the dramatic kind, no thunder, no wind, just the steady grey Oregon coast rain that soaks everything it touches and doesn't apologize for it. The wipers kept a slow, patient beat. She turned off the radio somewhere around Depot Bay and listened to the rain instead. She passed through Yachats, through communities of 3 streets and a post office, through headlands where the road climbed and the Pacific appeared in the gaps, grey, green and enormous, moving without concern for anything happening on the shore. Dunhaven sat at the end of a protected bay, a working harbour town, or what remained of 1-2 motels, a marine supply store, a diner, a small grocery, a handful of charter fishing operations, and a waterfront that had been converting slowly from working to recreational ever since the salmon runs declined. Her father had watched that conversion with something between sadness and stubbornness for the last decade of his life. Harold Callister had run a cannery on that waterfront for 40 years. He had processed Dungeness crab, salmon, albacore. He had employed local families. He had refused 3 buyout offers from larger companies and 2 separate approaches from resort developers, because Harold believed a cannery on a fishing bay was a reason for that bay to stay a fishing bay. He'd been right about most things. The cannery was at the north end of the waterfront, set back from the dock on a concrete foundation Harold had poured himself. A 2-story wood frame building, weatherboard siding, corrugated metal roof. The sign above the double doors, Callister Cannery, hand-painted in navy, had faded to grey. The siding was pale and chalky, peeling at the corners. Surface rust ran in orange streaks from the roof seams. But the walls were solid. She could see that even in the rain. She had a key on the ring she'd kept from the funeral. She'd transferred it from keychain to keychain for 8 years without thinking much about it, the way you keep things that belonged to people who are gone. She unlocked the front doors and pushed them open. The smell that came out was salt and old wood and machine oil. Not unpleasant, just old and waiting. The ground floor was dim, lit only by 2 windows crusted with salt residue and the grey light through the door she'd opened. The processing floor was a large open space, concrete underfoot, drain channels running to the centre, equipment still in place under brittle tarps. The kettles, the band saws, the packing tables, all covered, all dusty. Some of the tarps slipped and torn enough to show the equipment beneath. Surface rust, but the bones were sound. Harold had kept good machines the way he kept everything, steadily, without fanfare, because that was how things lasted. A wooden staircase at the back led to the 2nd floor. Nora climbed it carefully, testing each step. Every one held. The 2nd floor was divided, a small break room on one side, Harold's foreman's office on the other, separated by plywood partition. She went to the office. The desk was oak, old and heavy, the kind of desk that outlives the people who sit at it. On the desk, folded neatly at the far corner, sat Harold's reading glasses, wire-framed, one temple slightly bent where he'd repaired it with electrical tape rather than replace the pair. She picked them up and cleaned the lenses with the hem of her coat without thinking. She had done it 1,000 times as a girl. Harold was always leaving his glasses somewhere and asking her to fetch them. He'd say he was waiting for her to become a professional searcher, and she'd say she already was, and he'd say at least one of them had found their calling. She set them back on the desk. Above the window overlooking the bay, a tide chart was pinned to the wall, not a printed one. Harold had never trusted printed charts, always said the data didn't account for the particular behavior of Dunhaven Bay, how the channel narrowed at the South Headland and backed the tide up in ways that required knowing the place rather than just the numbers. This chart was hand-drawn on drafting paper, annotated in his careful blue ink, with marginal notes about specific dates, weather conditions, what the boats had brought in. 18 months of observations. He'd kept it updated himself until he was too sick to drive to the office. Between the chart and the desk, hanging from a bent nail on the partition, was a small brass ship's bell, the kind used on workboats as a call signal. Tarnished and dull with salt air, but she knew it. Harold had salvaged it from a boat he'd bought and sold before she was born. He said it brought the workers back from lunch faster than any clock, because people respond to a bell the way they respond to a voice, and a clock was nobody's voice. Reading glasses. Tide chart. Ship's bell. 3 things from a man who had stood in this office every working day for 40 years. The room still felt like him, like patience, like the knowledge that things worth doing take longer than you plan for. She opened the window. Sea air moved through the room, sharp with brine and the low-tide smell of exposed rock and kelp. From here she could see the whole bay. A pelican sat on a piling at the end of the dock. 2 trawlers rode at anchor, rocking in the swells. The working waterfront had gotten smaller since her childhood summers here, but it hadn't disappeared. Boats still went out. Fish still came in. She stood at the window for a long while, long enough for the light to shift and the rain to ease. Then she looked at the floor. The office had a rag rug, heavy wool. The colors faded now to muted rust and brown. It had been there as long as she could remember, a gift from her mother years before her mother died. Harold had kept it because the concrete below was cold, and he stood at his desk through most of the working day, but also because it had been Eleanor's, and Harold kept everything Eleanor touched. She looked at the edge of it. At the southeast corner, the concrete beneath should have been flush and even. But there was a seam there. Not a crack, a seam. Straight-edged, deliberate, the geometry of intention rather than age. Nora crouched down and pulled the rug back. The seam formed a panel, roughly 18 inches square, fitted flush with the surrounding floor. She found the purchase point at the near edge, a small gap, just enough for fingernails, and worked her fingers in and pulled. The panel lifted with a flat, gritty sound, like a drawer opening for the first time in years. Below was a cavity, 12 inches deep, set into the foundation. Inside, wrapped in oilskin cloth and set in a layer of dry sand, were 3 things: a metal box with a hasp, a bound ledger with a worn leather cover, and a bundle of envelopes tied with kitchen twine. Nora sat back on her heels and looked at them. Then she reached in and lifted out the ledger. The leather was dark and smooth, worn at the spine where years of handling had darkened the grain. Harold's name was on the inside cover in his own hand, with a date, January 1982. Nora sat at the edge of the desk and opened to the first page. Flynn family, boat engine, rebuilt starter and alternator, refused payment. Margaret Flynn is 8 months along. The work needed doing. She turned the page. Oswick, Vic, co-signed on the Pacific Dawn loan at First Coast Bank. He can make the payments, but barely. If the season's bad, he'll need help. We'll watch. Barrera family, Tommy working again after the shoulder. Gave him the packing room position through end of season. Good worker. Stubborn, reminds me of myself at that age. Page after page, entry after entry. Names she recognized, names she didn't. Fishing families, dock workers, the woman who ran the diner, the man who had owned the marine supply store before his son took over. Harold had kept a running account of every family in the bay. Not their debts, but their needs. He recorded when children were born, and when someone lost a job, and when a roof started to fail. He noted the loans some people eventually paid back and quietly forgave the ones who couldn't. Not as charity. Not as accounting. As a log of conditions, the way you record weather when your work depends on the weather, because ignoring conditions doesn't make them improve. She read for an hour in the fading afternoon light, and the office grew dim, and she didn't move to find a lamp. The entries grew more recent as she went deeper into the ledger, Harold's handwriting shifting, stronger in the early decades, slower and larger near the end, when his hands had begun to trouble him. But the practice never changed. Every family, every season, every act of help extended without announcement or expectation of credit. He hadn't told her about any of it. He hadn't told Eleanor. As far as she could find, he'd never mentioned the ledger to a single person in his life. He just kept it, kept doing what he did, and kept the record, because a man who worked with tides knew that keeping careful notes was how you prepared for conditions you hadn't seen yet. The metal box contained a set of unfamiliar keys, a quantity of cash in small bills, something near $1,400 by quick count, and an index card in Harold's handwriting for whoever needs it most when they get here. Beneath the cash was a folded legal document. She read it twice. It was notarized, dated 6 years before Harold died, and it transferred the operating license and equipment inventory of the Callister Cannery to an entity called the Dunhaven Bay Working Trust, with Nora listed as sole trustee. She sat with it in her hands. The trust held no separate assets beyond the cannery itself, but the language was specific, and it was careful. Under the document's terms, the cannery could not be sold for purposes inconsistent with commercial fishing operations without the approval of a 5-member trustee board, 3 of whom were required to be active Dunhaven fishermen. Harold had built a legal structure around the cannery that made it nearly impossible to sell to a developer. He hadn't told her. He'd just done it, and let it wait. She opened the bundle of letters last. 11 envelopes, each addressed to Harold in different handwriting. She opened the first. Mr. Callister, I don't know how to say what you did for us when Tommy was out of work. I never asked you, and you never said anything about it, and I didn't know what to say. My mother says sometimes you're just supposed to say thank you even when you don't have the right words. Thank you. Rosa, Barrera, the others were the same ordinary people writing plain words to a man who had done something for them without seeking recognition, and their gratitude was in letters they'd hoped he'd keep. He had kept every one. She read them all, sitting on the floor of her father's cannery, as the light outside went grey, and then darker. And the building settled around her in the quiet that comes to a building after a long silence. A readiness, as though it had been waiting for someone to come back and hear it. Near the bottom of the bundle was one envelope that was different. Sealed, not opened, addressed in Harold's own hand. A single word on the front. Nora. She set it aside. She wasn't ready for that one yet. She slept on a camp cot she found folded in the storage closet. Harold had kept it for late nights during the busy season, and woke to the particular silence of a coastal morning. The bay barely moving, the pelican back on the piling, or perhaps it had never left. She made coffee from a sealed can she found in the break room cabinet and stood at the window. Pale light on the water. The kind of morning that doesn't announce itself, just shows up and keeps going. She heard tires on gravel at 8:15. She came downstairs to find a woman standing at the edge of the lot, looking at the cannery with one hand shading her eyes against the low morning sun. She was in her mid-70s, broad-shouldered, wearing a canvas coat and rubber-soled boots. White hair pinned under a knit cap. The face of someone who had spent 60 years in coastal weather and decided to outlast it. "I saw the light on last night," the woman said. "Didn't know if someone had bought the place or was just going through it." "Neither," Nora said. "I'm Harold's daughter. I inherited it." The woman dropped her hand. Her expression opened. "Nora, not a question, a recognition. You stand like him. Same way of holding your weight, like you're checking the ground before you commit to it." She put out her hand. "Bet Oswick. I ran the bait shop at the other end of the dock for 30 years. My husband Vic fished out of Dunhaven his whole life." She paused. "Harold and Vic played cards every other Thursday for 20 years. "I remember Vic," Nora said. "Vaguely, a large, slow-voiced man, always at the edge of childhood summers." "When did he?" 4 years ago. Hart. Bet said it without flinching. The way people say things they have made their peace with. "Come on. I brought good coffee. Whatever Harold left in that can is going to taste like it was dried in 2014. They sat in the foreman's office in 2 chairs Bet pulled from the break room, and Bet's coffee was strong and hot and carried the faint mineral quality of well water. She looked around the room at Harold's things, the glasses, the tide chart, the bell, with the easy familiarity of someone who had been here before. "He kept this place very Harold," she said. "He kept everything very Harold." Bet nodded. She turned the mug in both hands. "I'll tell you what I know, since you look like someone trying to figure out what you've got here. Vic had a bad season in 1994. Harold guaranteed the refinancing on Vic's boat, the Pacific Dawn, without collateral, without interest. Just said, pay when it's right. 2 years later, Vic came to settle the debt, and Harold said the money had already found a use. Wouldn't touch it. She smiled at the memory, briefly, and then became serious again. "Your father was the reason this dock stayed a working dock as long as it did. Every time a developer came looking at the North waterfront, Harold just didn't cooperate. He owned the North Tidewater access rights, which meant any significant development north of the marina required his approval. He never gave it. Just kept running the cannery and signing the access renewal every 5 years. Nora thought about the trust document in the metal box. "There's something I need to show you," she said. Bet read the trust document slowly, glasses low on her nose. When she finished, she set it on the desk beside Harold's reading glasses and looked at Nora over the frames. "Harold drew this up 6 years before he died," Nora said. "He named me trustee. He never mentioned it. He wouldn't have." Bet turned the document in her hands. He didn't believe in telling people things in advance. He believed in doing things correctly and letting them be found when the finding mattered. She looked at Clause 4. "The Tidewater access rights are attached to the Cannery Trust, which means as long as this trust stands, no one develops the North waterfront without the trustees' consent. Nora had not read it closely enough to catch that. She went back and found the clause. Bet was right. My brother Carl doesn't know any of this, Nora said. Bet was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, your brother has been in contact with the parish group. She said the name the way you name a weather system. Not with fear, but with attention. They've been looking at the North waterfront for 2 years. Resort hotel, residential units, marina redevelopment. They've approached Carl at least twice. He told them the Cannery would be available. He doesn't own it. I know that. You know that. Bet folded her hands on the desk. Your father knew Carl was talking to developers even before Harold died. That trust document was Harold's answer to it. Nora sat with that for a moment, letting it settle. There's a letter, she said, in the compartment where I found the ledger. In Harold's writing. My name on it. Bet looked at her. I haven't opened it yet. Then I'll let you. Bet stood and refilled both mugs without asking. And I'll tell you one more thing. This morning, before I came over, I called 5 families on this bay who are going to want to know you're here. The Barreras, the Flynns, May Dunmore. People who know what Harold did for them. They're going to start showing up. She buttoned her coat. Get the windows clean, Nora. Let people see there's a light on. Nora worked through the morning. She swept the processing floor, cleared 8 years of salt residue from the windows with newspaper and vinegar from Bet's supply store. She pulled the tarps off 2 of the steam kettles and inspected the equipment beneath, solid surface rust at the fittings, but not compromised. Harold had kept machines the way he kept promises, faithfully, and for the long run. By noon, 2 cars had pulled into the lot. She didn't recognize either driver. Both left something at the door, a container of soup, a bag of cleaning supplies, a note that said, "We heard you were here. Harold's daughter. Welcome home." A teenage boy came by after school and asked if there was anything he could carry or fix. She put him to work on the gutters, blocked solid with 8 years of cedar debris. He worked without complaint for 2 hours. Refused payment. Said his grandfather had worked Harold's packing floor for 15 years, and that paying Harold back was a family obligation, not a favor. At 4 in the afternoon, with the light going copper over the water, Nora went back upstairs and sat at Harold's desk. She picked up the sealed envelope, worked the flap open carefully. 2 sheets of yellow legal paper, folded in thirds, covered in Harold's hand. Nora, it begun. If you're reading this, you found the flaw, which means you're paying more attention than you were the last time you were here. Good, I always knew you would. She read slowly. I want to tell you what this cannery was for, because I don't think you ever fully knew, and I think you should know it now. I built this place in 1972 on borrowed money and 30 years of having worked for other people's operations. I was terrified for the first 5 years that it was going to fail. It didn't fail, not because I was particularly skilled or particularly lucky, but because the people on this bay needed it not to fail. And when people need something to keep going, they help it keep going. That's the only real business principle I ever believed in. I kept the records you found. I want you to understand what they are. They're not a list of debts owed to me. They're a log of how this place functioned, what it was actually doing. Beyond processing fish, it was holding people together. Being here so that other things could keep existing. Every loan was a vote of confidence the community placed in itself. I just administered the votes. I know about Glenn. I have known for a long time. You told me very little, and I understood why. You learnt to make things smaller than they were because it was easier than watching the person you trusted most fail to rise to them. You got that from me. I kept things small too. I didn't tell your mother about half of what worried me, and I don't know whether that was wisdom or cowardice. Probably both. I left this cannery to you, and not to Carl, because I believe you understand what it was for, and he does not. I am not angry at Carl. I am sad for him the way you're sad for someone who was taught to measure everything and never learned that the most important things resist measurement. He will try to take the cannery. I'm sorry about that. I have done what I could to make sure he cannot succeed. There is a document in the storage room behind the east shelf, in a panel that I may have sealed a little too quickly. Find it. The Tidewater access rights are yours. They were always going to be yours. I registered them 30 years ago for the day when someone would finally try to take the waterfront. Keep the coffee on, Nora. The bell still works. Let people know the cannery is here. I love you. I always did, even when I didn't say it often enough. You are the best thing this place ever made, and I have been waiting 20 years to say that somewhere you might actually hear it. Harold, if you've made it this far into Nora's story, stay with me. What comes next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Hit subscribe so you're here when it lands. The legal letter arrived 3 weeks after Nora reopened the cannery doors. She was at the desk when Bet brought it in from the lot, heavy stock paper, Portland law firm letterhead, the kind of envelope that announces its contents before you open it. She read it standing up. Then she sat down and read it again. Carl was filing a motion with Clatsop County to establish co-inheritance rights over the Callister cannery. His lawyers argued the will's language created a joint tenancy by default, that Harold's failure to use the word solely when naming Nora rendered the bequest ambiguous. They further argued that Nora's unilateral decisions regarding the property, specifically her refusal to consider the parish group's offer, constituted a breach of her duty as a co-owner. Bet read it after Nora set it down. Pressure filing, Bet said. Carl's betting you fold before a judge sees it. He's done this before, Nora said. His first business failed when he was 30. He borrowed money, didn't pay it back, and spent a year arguing that everyone around him had failed him. He has a talent for believing he's owed things he didn't earn. What did Harold do when Carl's business failed? Nora thought about the ledger. She hadn't found Carl's name in it yet, not specifically, but she remembered one brief entry near the back. Carl's business filing complete. He doesn't want to talk about it. I'll leave it alone. No dollar amount. No complaint, just a notation and a date. He left Carl alone, she said. He let Carl be whatever Carl was going to be. She picked up the letter. I'm not going to do the same. That evening she called Connie, who had said when Nora called to tell her about the divorce, "Tell me where you are and I'll come sit with you." She told Connie about the cannery, the ledger, the trust, and Carl's legal motion. Connie was quiet. Then, what do you need? A lawyer who knows property trust law. I know someone. She used to practice commercial real estate in Portland. Very good. I'll send you her number tonight. A pause. Nora, are you all right out there? Nora looked around the office. Harold's glasses on the desk. The tide chart on the wall. The brass bell hanging on its nail. I think so, she said. It's the strangest thing. I came here because I had nowhere else to go, and it doesn't feel like a consolation prize. Carl called the following afternoon. He'd heard she had a lawyer now. Mountain News, Bet would have said, fastest thing on the bay. Nora. His voice had the particular ease of someone who has already decided how a conversation will go. We should talk before this gets complicated. It's already complicated, Carl. Look, the parish group's offer is real. The land is worth substantially more than 17,000 with a development variance. You'd do well out of this. We both would. Why are you holding on to a broken-down cannery on a road nobody uses? Because it's not just a cannery. What is it then? She thought about how to answer. About Harold's ledger. About Vic Oswick's boat. About the Barrera family. The Flynns. May Dunmore. About the teenage boy on the gutters who refused payment because paying Harold back was a family obligation. It's the reason people on this bay still have their boats, she said. And their houses. And their businesses. Dad spent 40 years holding this community together, quietly, without telling anyone what he was doing. The trust he created makes this place impossible to sell for development without destroying what it was built to protect. He planned it that way. Deliberately, silence on the line. "I'll see you at the hearing, Carl," she said, and hung up. Glenn called the following week. She hadn't expected that. "I heard about the property situation," he said. His voice was careful, the tone of someone measuring their words. "I wanted to say, I hope it resolves cleanly. I know your father built something there." Nora was standing at the window, watching a trawler come in across the bay. "He did," she said. "If you need anything, I don't," she said. It wasn't cold, it was just true. She thanked him and ended the call. She went back downstairs and got to work. The lawyer Connie sent was named Renata Park, who drove down from Portland on a Wednesday in a grey raincoat carrying a canvas briefcase. She was in her late 40s, sharp-eyed, with the practiced patience of someone who had spent decades untangling documents designed to obscure rather than clarify. She sat at Harold's desk and read for nearly 2 hours without speaking. Nora brought coffee. Bet came and sat in the corner. A man named Ray Kimura, who ran the Marine Electronics, shop 2 streets off the waterfront, and had spent the previous week rehabilitating the cannery's equipment at Bet's request, stopped by to drop off a written estimate and ended up staying. When Renata finished reading, she removed her glasses and set them on the desk beside Harold's. "The trust is valid," she said. "Properly notarized, properly structured. Under Oregon trust law, the property transferred to the trust at Harold's death, not to his estate. It was never subject to probate. It is not subject to the will's inheritance language. Harold made certain of that. Nora had suspected as much. So Carl has no claim. His entire claim rests on the will's ambiguous language that has no authority over property that transferred out of Harold's estate 6 years before he died. Carl's lawyers are going to argue he didn't know about the trust. That doesn't matter, legally, and they know it. What they're hoping for is that you settle, rather than fight." Renata looked at her steadily. "I want to file a declaratory action establishing the trust's authority before Carl's motion gained traction. Get to the courthouse first with the cleaner document." "Do it," Nora said. Renata made notes. Then she looked up. "There's one more item. The trust document references tidewater access rights attached to the property, Clause 4. To assert those rights in a legal proceeding, I'd want the original deed that created them. Have you been through everything in the building? I found one compartment in the office floor. I haven't gone through the storage room fully." Renata looked at her. "Tonight," she said. Bet stayed. The two of them went to the storage room after Renata left, flashlights in hand, working methodically through decades of Harold's careful record-keeping, maintenance logs, supplier invoices, equipment manuals, tide charts going back to the early 1970s. Bet took the shelves. Nora took the walls. She found it in the far corner behind a panel painted to match the wall. not as precisely hidden as the office floor. A different kind of concealment, as if Harold had done this one in less time, entrusted it to a different kind of camouflage. The panel came away easily. Behind it, in a smaller cavity, was a single document in a clear plastic sleeve. The deed. Original, notarized, signed by 3 county commissioners. It established Harold's ownership of the North Tidewater access rights in 1989 and attached them to the Cannery property in perpetuity. He had filed it with the county, registered it, let it sit there for 30 years, waiting to matter when mattering was needed. Bet held it under the lamp. She was quiet for a moment. He had this filed since 1989, she said. I lived on this waterfront for 40 years and didn't know it existed. He didn't need anyone to know, Nora said. He just needed it to be real. She went back to the office and sat at the desk. She opened Harold's letter and read it through once more, the part about the storage room, the part about the Tidewater rights. He had written it years before he died, planning for exactly this moment, not anxious, not angry, just thorough. A man who read tides left nothing to chance that didn't have to be. She picked up the brass ship's bell from its nail and turned it in her hands. Then she went to the window, opened it to the bay air, and rang it. Once clear and carrying, the note moving out over the water and into the darkening sky. Bet appeared in the doorway. That's Harold saying he's glad you're home, she said. The hearing was on a Thursday 6 weeks after Carl filed his motion. Renata had filed the declaratory action 2 weeks prior, and the judge consolidated both matters. Cleaner this way, Renata said. One hearing, all issues addressed. Carl arrived with 2 lawyers from a Portland firm Nora recognized. They had a strategy. They weren't truly arguing for co-inheritance anymore. Renata's filing had made that ground too difficult. They were arguing that the trust itself was invalid, that Harold had lacked the clarity of intent necessary to form it, pointing to the years between its creation and his death as evidence of inconsistency. It was a poor argument. Renata took it apart methodically, producing Harold's medical records from the period of the trust's signing, his notarization documentation, and a letter from his physician confirming full cognitive health at the time of execution. Then, Bet took the stand. She had prepared carefully with Renata, but the testimony she gave was entirely her own. 30 years on the Dunhaven waterfront, Vic's work. What the Cannery had meant to the bay's economic life through 4 decades of declining salmon runs and changing markets. She described the Tidewater access rights and how Harold had used them, quietly, to limit development pressure on the North waterfront when it would have displaced working operations. Harold Cannister understood what that waterfront was for, she said, and he spent his life making sure it could keep being that. The trust document reflects exactly that understanding. There is nothing inconsistent about it. There is nothing irregular. It is the work of a man who knew precisely what he was doing. Carl's lawyers cross-examined her briefly. She answered without embellishment or hesitation. Then, Renata presented the Tidewater deed. She explained its implications carefully, for the judge, for the record, for Carl. The access rights, attached to the Cannery Trust in perpetuity, made the North waterfront development Carl had been discussing with the parish group legally impossible without the trustees' consent. Without Nora's agreement, the development could not proceed. Carl looked at his lawyers. The junior one leaned in and said something quiet. Then Renata asked the judge's permission to enter one additional document into the record, a specific passage from Harold's ledger. The judge nodded. She read the entry Nora had found during a close second reading of the ledger, an entry near the back that she hadn't shared with Carl. hadn't mentioned to anyone outside of Renata. Carl's debt to First Commerce Bank called in threatening judgment, paid the balance anonymously through a cashier's check via the county legal aid office. Carl doesn't know. He would refuse if he knew it was from me. 11,200. This is what fathers do. The courtroom went quiet. Carl sat very still. His hands on the table did not move. Your father paid off $11,200 of your debt, Renata said, not reading now, just speaking clearly, anonymously, because he knew you'd refuse it if it came from him. He never told you. He never told your sister. He never mentioned it to anyone. He just did it, the way he did everything else, because you were his son, and this is what fathers do. Carl's jaw tightened. His expression moved through several things quickly, and then settled into something Nora had not seen on his face in a very long time. Recognition. He looked at the window. At nothing particular. The judge asked Carl's lawyers for a rebuttal to the trust validity argument. The senior lawyer conferred quietly with his client, then stood. Your Honor, we'd like to request a continuance to review the Tidewater deed documentation. Denied, the judge said. That documentation has been available for review since the declaratory filing. Counsel had ample time. He looked at both tables. I have reviewed the trust instrument, the deed, the chain of title and the testimony. The Callister Cannery transferred to the Dunhaven Bay Working Trust at Harold Callister's death. The will's language has no authority over trust assets. The motion for co-inheritance is denied. The trust's authority over the property, including the Tidewater access rights, is affirmed. He closed his folder. This matter is closed. In the parking lot outside, Carl caught up with Nora before she reached her car. Nora, she turned. He looked like Harold around the eyes. She had always been able to see it, even when she didn't want to. He had Harold's way of standing when something had gotten past his defenses, slightly forward, like a man preparing to say something he hadn't planned on saying. $11,000, he said. I didn't know. I know you didn't. A long silence. The parking lot was nearly empty. A gull crossed overhead. Why like that? Carl said. Why anonymously? Why not just... He could have said something. He could have told me. Any time. Nora thought about Harold's letter. About what he'd written regarding Carl and measurement and the things that resist it. Because he wanted you to have it, she said, without it costing you anything. Without you having to feel like you owed him. He didn't want a debt between you. He just wanted you to be okay. Carl looked at her. The argument he'd carried for months was visibly falling away from him, the legal strategy, the certainty that he'd been wronged. What was left underneath was older and quieter. Can I come see it? He said. The Cannery. Nora looked at him for a long moment. Come on a Sunday, she said. I'll have coffee on. She drove home on the coast road, through cedar and fog and the salt smell of the ocean, and the word home kept meaning exactly what she'd let it mean. Spring moved into the bay the way it does on the Oregon coast, slowly, tentatively, stepping back for storms, and then advancing again into something that almost, on certain afternoons, resembled warmth. The rhododendrons along the headland road bloomed pink and red in March. The grey water shifted toward green. Nora reopened the Callister Cannery on the 1st of April. Not the full operation. Not yet. The electrical upgrade had taken most of February, contracted out to a crew from Yachats who knew commercial wiring and didn't overcharge for knowing it. Ray Kimura had overseen the equipment rehabilitation himself, evenings and weekends, bringing his son Marco 2 weekends running because the refrigeration units needed 2 sets of hands. Nora paid what she could toward both. The rest went into the ledger she'd started keeping in Harold's desk. In the same careful tradition, a running record of what she owed, to whom, and when it might be right to settle. What opened on the 1st of April was the processing room, partially, and the dockside door, and Harold's foreman's office upstairs where the coffee was always on. She accepted consignment work from 3 small trawl operations that couldn't afford the larger processing facility 40 miles north. Local catch, processed locally, the way it had been done on this waterfront for a century. The coffee pot ran from 6 in the morning until whoever closed up turned it off. The dockside bell, a larger one than the ship's bell, was rehung by a man named Barrera whose grandfather had worked Harold's packing floor. He said his grandfather had described Harold ringing it at the end of the season every year, once for each boat that had come in safe. On the first morning of operation, Nora rang it once. For the building. For Harold. For the idea that some things are worth keeping. Word travelled the way it travelled in Dunhaven, without wires, without announcement. By the second week, 4 trawlers were using the facility. By the end of the month, a 5th. The operation didn't make money yet, but it covered its costs. Nora took a salary from the trust that was modest enough not to feel indulgent and enough not to require daily worry. Bet came. Every morning, she was better at the relationships, the long-standing ones that required knowing who was related to whom, and what had happened in 1997, and why a certain family preferred to be approached a certain way. Nora was better at the operations side, the documents, the systems. Together they covered most of what the Cannery needed. Marco Kimura came on part-time in May. He was 24, a trained mechanic who'd been working at a dealership in Coos Bay and didn't especially want to be. He learned the processing floor quickly and asked the right questions, which was the most important quality Nora had come to look for in anyone. One morning in late May, a woman arrived at the dockside door. She was perhaps 30, wearing a waterproof jacket and carrying a duffel bag. She stood at the threshold with the careful posture of someone who'd learned not to assume they were welcome. "I heard you might need someone on the loading dock," she said. Nora hadn't posted anything, but Dunhaven moved information without anyone posting. "What's your background?" 3 years at a processing facility in Astoria. Packing, loading, some forklift. She paused. "I need steady work. I have a daughter. We're staying with my aunt in town, but I need something that isn't temporary." Her name was Wren. She had the direct way of speaking that comes from not having the luxury of being indirect. Nora hired her on the spot, watched her work for 2 weeks, and made it full-time. An easy decision. Wren was fast, careful, and never pretended to know things she didn't know. When Marco showed her how the bandsaw worked, she watched with her full attention and didn't touch it until she understood it completely. Carl came on a Sunday in June. He drove down from Medford, arrived at 10 when the dock was quiet and the water was the closest to blue it ever got in Dunhaven. Nora walked him through the building. He asked practical questions about the trust, the operation, the access rights. He was trying to understand, not trying to find an angle. The difference was visible. In the foreman's office, Carl stood at the window the way Nora had stood on her first day, looking at the bay. "He could have told me," Carl said, "about the money, about any of it. He could have. Why didn't he? Because then it would have been about him." Nora set her mug on the desk. He didn't want it to be about him. He just wanted the thing to be done. Carl was quiet for a long while. "Then, I was going to sell this place, Nora. I had the developer's numbers. I thought it was a windfall." He pressed his hands flat against the desk. "I didn't see what it was." You see it now? Yeah, he said. I do. She poured him coffee from Harold's pot and they sat together in the office that still smelled like machine oil and sea air and patience, and watched the bay move in the afternoon light. And the silence between them was not entirely comfortable, but it was honest, and honest was something they could both work with. By September, the Callister Cannery processed fish 5 days a week. Nora walked the dock at 6 each morning before anyone arrived, checking the equipment, the water, the conditions. The habit had come to her without her deciding it, the way most of the right habits had come. Bet had found a photograph, in a box in the old bait shop, Harold at the dockside door, sometime in the early 1980s, one hand on the frame, squinting into afternoon sun. The Cannery sign behind him freshly painted, letters dark and clean. Smiling the way of someone who doesn't smile easily, but means it fully when they do. Nora hung it in the office beside the tide chart. Wren's daughter came to the dock after school on most days and did her homework at the packing table. She was 8, quiet, with the patience of someone much older. She had already asked Marco to explain the compressor, which Marco had done in careful detail, and she had written it down in a spiral notebook. When Nora offered to teach her to read a tide chart, she said yes immediately, and sat down at Harold's desk as though she had always meant to sit there. On a Tuesday in late September, with the first real storm of the season building offshore, Nora closed the Cannery as the light failed. She locked the dockside door. She stood on the dock in the rising wind, listening to the bay, watching the trawlers ride the swells at anchor. She went back up to the office. She picked up Harold's reading glasses, cleaned the lenses with the hem of her coat, and set them back beside the tide chart and the brass ship's bell. 3 objects from a man who had kept a waterfront alive with patience and quiet, and the slow accumulation of acts that no one was ever meant to see. She turned off the lights one by one, the front room, the stockroom, the counter-lamp. She walked downstairs and turned off the ground floor. Through the front window, the Callister Cannery sign glowed against the darkening sky, faded, hand-painted, and lit. She locked the door, stood on the dock in the wind and listened to the water. Nora Harfield was 57 years old. She had a cannery on a working bay. She had a ledger she was filling with names. She had a daughter's homework on the packing table and a boy's questions about the compressor, and a brother who was learning, slowly, that the most important things resist measurement. She was just getting started. Some places look worthless from the outside. From the inside, they look like 40 years of love, sealed beneath the floor, waiting for the right person to come home and find them.